Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to Project Zero's inaugural Page Turners Book Talk series. My name is Carrie James, and this is Liz Dawes-Derising. We are co-directors of Project Zero. For those of you who don't know what Project Zero is, it is a 60-year-old research center that has been here at the Ed School, and it's got a pretty tremendous history. We've conducted research that is crucial on cognition, the arts, civic learning, and other topics that are important now more than ever. Howard Gardner was co-director of Project Zero with Dave Perkins, who is also here in the audience. I've lost sight of where, there he is in the back. Woo! Both of them are still active and beloved members of our research center. Howard has also been a super meaningful mentor and colleague to each of us, and we could not be more delighted that Howard's work will kick off this series.
So this feels like an apt time for us to have a discussion about the bold and impactful work of Howard over the years. As Carrie said, he has been an incredible mentor and beloved colleague for all of us at Project Zero. For me personally, he was my doctoral advisor. Now we'd like to turn things over to Joe Blatt, who's also an esteemed and longtime colleague here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education as a senior lecturer.
Thank you, Carrie and Liz, and thank you especially for acknowledging what a strange time this is at Harvard. But of course, I think that just makes it all the more motivating to turn to what we hope will become again the principal preoccupation here, which is research, thinking, fostering healthy human development, and publishing books about that. And it's the books that we're celebrating today, specifically Howard Gardner's books. So, in the age of e-books, what I'm about to say may not be relevant much longer, but for those of us who really care about physical books, one of the topics that comes up a lot in places like the New York Times Book Review or other places where books are discussed is the question of how do you organize your books? How do you lay them out? Should they be chronological, alphabetical, in the order that you bought them, by height, so that you have nice cross lines, or color, so that it's part of the decor. But I actually organize my books by subject, and here are some of the subject sections in my books. And because of that, this has brought home to me very powerfully what an incredibly diverse literary output and research Howard Gardner has created, because he has books in my education section, including some that I think many people here will be familiar with, but also basic research in cognitive psychology. Howard's also ventured into the arts and, in fact, into philosophy. Books on leadership, books that have taken him into the realm of biography and history. And in fact, books that are so hard to categorize that I kind of keep moving it back and forth between sections, which is why that's on its side there. So in that context of the incredible varied work that Howard's done, it's not entirely amazing that the books that we're especially spotlighting today, the new collections of Howard's work that you can see in the table there, contains a huge range, addresses a huge range of subjects. Here's a little sense of what's in the volume, on education. I'll just give you a second to look at the range of education subjects that Howard has investigated. And that's just volume one. There's also a volume on Howard's work on mind. And you can see, again, the really broad range of work that Howard has done. So we'll have a lot to talk about in this conversation, and I'm going to mainly talk about your research and your work, but I do have a couple of biographical questions. So first is, would you agree that you are the second most famous person to come from Scranton, Pennsylvania?
First of all, thanks, Joe, very much for that nice introduction. We didn't prepare anything, so this is both what you said and what you asked me are unrehearsed. Yes, and it's interesting because Joe Biden was here yesterday at Harvard, but we don't know each other, even though we're the same age and we both come from Scranton. He left pretty early, and we were in different worlds. And I don't know him, and he doesn't know me. Nonetheless, given he looks pretty good in comparison to what we're dealing with now, which is the most political statement I will make.
I bet not, but we'll see. I knew he came to Harvard. I actually thought he came to Harvard yesterday because of this event. He wanted to make sure that he was still number one from Scranton. So maybe there's a active Scranton to Cambridge pipeline that I don't know about, but I'm guessing not. And I'm guessing that then you arrived at Harvard as an undergraduate pretty much on your own. So just say a little bit about what it was like to come here as a freshman.
Sure. Let me check. Is this mic working okay?
Yep.
Okay. Good. Thank you. I was born in 1943 in Scranton. My parents were German Jewish immigrants who made it to the United States on the night of the shattering glass, November 9th, 1938. So I had over my shoulders not only the Holocaust, but also a brother who died when my mother was pregnant with me. As a kid, I was a studious kid, but not frighteningly studious, and a serious pianist. And when I turned 12, my teacher said, well, now you have to go to New York and practice 3 hours a day, which meant I would have to take a bus or a train and practice 3 hours a day. And I said no. And I think that was a good decision for me and for the rest of the world. But I mentioned that background because my mind really was opened up by coming to Cambridge in the early 1960s. And I've been here for 64 years, which makes me at Harvard longer than 90% of the audience has been alive. I don't like the metaphor of kid in the candy store, but I just couldn't take enough courses and couldn't form enough relationships with teachers. It was a wonderful experience for me. And it was a time when men were incredibly predominant. There were almost no women faculty members. And while Radcliffe existed, and Longfellow was actually a Radcliffe building. They used to say the professors would give lectures in the yard, and they would come over to Radcliffe and take out the dirty jokes and give the same lectures. I have no idea whether that's true or not. Did
they get paid again for doing it twice? That sounds like worth looking into.
That I don't know. But I saw the questions that were submitted, and I'm not going to go into this unless you want to. But a very interesting question was submitted. It said, if you could relive a part of your life, which would it be? And the very short answer is when I graduated from college in the next 5 years. That was absolutely formative for me, and no one could have predicted it even a year earlier.
So when you got here and there was this candy store of options and courses in front of you, did you know that psychology was going to be the destination, or when did that emerge?
No, and this is actually relevant to the book. The book contains stuff I wrote that I thought was worth preserving. I've written over 30 books and countless articles, and I always say not even my mother would have read all of them. So I had the chance to distill them into 2 volumes. But the books are not just my collected papers. There are 100 what I call legends, and these are before the articles or the chapters from the books. I say, this is where I was, this is what interested me, this is why I did what I did, and here's where I would change my mind now. So it's an intellectual autobiography as well as greatest hits kind of thing.
I was actually going to ask you about that later, but since you brought it up now, is it your intent? Was it your intent to motivate or context the work? Do you think it needs to be appreciated in its original historical context, or what? I mean, that's a lot of extra work.
You're reminding me of the question you just asked, which I jumped over. I was going to be a history major because when you're in high school, you hear of history. I never heard of psychology, except I had an uncle who gave me a psychology book when I was in high school because he sensed I was interested in psychology. And my eyes are terrible. I don't have binocular vision. I can't recognize faces. I don't have stereopsis. But I'm also prosopagnostick. I can't recognize faces. But in this textbook by Norman Munn, they showed what it was like to be colorblind. And I said, my goodness, somebody can explain some of the craziness in my head. But I was going to be a history major, but the history tutorial, you had to take a tutorial, was doing historiography. And historiography is not reading history. It's not the decline and fall of the Third Reich or the Roman Empire. It's how do you do history? And I wasn't interested in that. So I was very interested in Erik Erikson, who was a very famous psychiatrist who did psychohistory. And so I decided to work in what was called social relations, of an amalgam field of psychology, sociology, and anthropology. But even when I was graduating from college, I wouldn't have known that I was going to be going into psychology. I just knew this was my general interest. But here's an interesting thing, which I think is in the book, because in the last few years of my life, I've become very interested in synthesizing. And you can ask me what I mean by that. My memoir is called A Synthesizing Mind. But I became interested in how historians synthesize, because they take lots of information and put it together and organize it and make it palatable. So I discovered that the man who did my sophomore tutorial, his name was Eric Gruen. He's even older than I am. He's a professor at Berkeley, retired. And I wrote to him, I said, I'm finally ready to take your seminar because I'm interested in historiography. And, professors do talk to each other. So he wrote back, and that was a nice closure. But one of the very sad things now, and this is not particularly about the current administration, it's about what's happening in colleges generally. Wendy Fishman and I wrote a book called The Real World of College, and some people who are here actually work with us on this work in college. The whole notion of liberal arts and of having a broad education, which you had because you went to Harvard College, is really being squeezed out by professionalism and money on the one hand. And I have to say, I'm sure this will come up, what AI can do, because, if ChatGPT can write your papers, then you may not decide to write them yourself.
So I illustrated the range of your work in all the different disciplines. Do you think that being in SOCREL, that amalgam of various traditional disciplines, set you on the course of looking so broadly and in such an interdisciplinary way?
I think it certainly is consistent with that. But I took music courses, I took art courses. I wasn't focused particularly on the social sciences. I think if I'd had a different tutor, I might well have ended up doing history. So it was almost an accident that I ended up in psychology. And then, as you know, it was I hitched a ride to Ann Arbor at the end of my senior year at college because I was thinking I would do clinical psychology at the University of Michigan. But the guy who drove the car was a cognitive psycholinguist, David McNeil. He'd be known to people who know that sort of thing. And he said, well, there's this guy Bruner, and I may or may not have heard his name. I don't even know. He's hiring people to work with him on a curriculum for kids to learn about social studies. It was called, and this is again very dated, Man, a Course of Study. You would never call a curriculum now Man, a Course of Study. And I said, what the hell? So I went to visit Bruner. I'd already accepted a job at the Devereaux Clinic to work with psychiatric patients. But Bruner was a very magnetic personality, and it sounded to me like it'd really be interesting. And I knew I was going away to England for a year, so I didn't have to go right away to graduate school. So that flipped me, and that's why I said if I could look at myself from roughly 1965 to 1971, that's the answer to the question about how I'd like to understand better why I became what I became. Because I have a good memory for stuff I've read, and even for stuff I've written, but I don't even have a particular memory for experiences. Photographs, of course, are very helpful, and movies now are helpful, but it's not like I can run a video of what I was like in the summer of '65. How many of you can kind of run a video of what you were like 10 years ago? And I guess video is helpful because then it comes back. Yeah.
So I just parenthetically, because I imagine a lot of people here don't know about the MANA course of study, that also anticipates kind of the present era, right? Didn't that provoke a whole lot of controversy and banning and so on?
Sure, and we need to talk about that. But let me first say that if I had to pick 3 most important experiences in my life, clearly working on MANA course of study was one of them. Because we worked in the Underwood School in Newton, where I eventually became a teacher. Almost nobody knows that I taught K through 2 for a year. I was terrible. But I did it because I felt that I was studying kids. I should work with them. But every day we would develop a curriculum unit. We would try it out with kids who were 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and then we would analyze how it worked, and we would rewrite stuff for the next day. It was very, very exciting. And MANA course of study, again, the name is very anachronistic. 3 questions. What makes human beings human? How did we get to be that way? And how can we be made more so, more human, or we might say more humane? What makes human beings human? How do we get that way? Of course, that's an archaeological and anthropological and genetic question. And how can we be made more so? That's a question about ethics and about love and love of the planet, love of living things, love of even the mountains and the water. And if you were to ask me, and you may, what I think students should be studying now, I think those 3 questions. But what you asked me was, and this is so reminiscent of today.
That's why,
though I hadn't put 2 and 2 together. This curriculum was well supported by the government and by private foundations. That's when I first learned about fundraising, and it was used in Newton Public Schools. In fact, Leah Rosofsky, the daughter of Henry Rosofsky, was the dean. She's now the head of the Athenaeum. She was a student on the Underwood School in 1965, and that summer. The curriculum was very contemporary, and it dealt with things which upset people who were on the political right. For example, the Netsilik Eskimos, who, when they get old, they put the old people on the ice floes, people like me, and they let them out to sea. I think that's a great idea, by the way, but count me in. But the Congress didn't like it at all, and it was seen to be sort of spoiled Cambridge intellectuals. There was a lot of Chomsky linguistics. How many of you know about Chomsky? Okay, well, he was just getting to be known at that time. I met him and many other people through working on this stuff. And so the House of Representatives decided to make MANA course of study something to attack. And Peter Dow, who's still alive, was a contemporary of mine, wrote a book called Schoolhouse Politics about how the conservatives of that era, people in the right wing, demolished the curriculum. And Bruner, who was kind of witty, said, "We never solved the problem of getting from Widener to Wichita."
Right.
You all know Widener Library? That's where people hang around. How many of you go to Widener Library? Good. Well, but Wichita is far away. It's Kansas. What's the matter with Kansas? Yeah. So that curriculum worked very well for people who were interested in Chomsky linguistics. What's the human language like? We worked with Irving DeVore on baboons and on evolution, and we worked on different norms. The Netsilik Eskimos, as I just said, but people who lived in other non-Western societies, and that was seen as being brainwashing. And if I made a decision, which is a public decision. I decided not to sign any petitions about what's going on at Harvard. I just thought that was a good decision. But I decided that if I want to write something, I'll write it in my own name. And maybe I'll go back and read Peter Dow's book. It's a book I actually saved, and see how much of the stuff that was said in the late 60s and early 70s is being said again. It is history repeating itself.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of the parallel until you mentioned Manicourse's study. So we're going to turn to your work in just a minute, but just one last autobiographical question, which is you've been talking about the enthusiasm that you felt in school and in meeting Bruner and so on. But my sense from your autobiography is that there came a point in graduate school where you were ready to throw up the whole thing. Did I get that right?
Right. Well, I don't want Helen to hear this, or Katie, because they're about to go off and do doctoral work.
Oh dear. Okay.
No, they're
Fingers in ears.
They're allowed to look in the book. Yeah. No. Professionalism then, as now, and I think most of you here are in that world, is very much going down a straight and narrow and behaving in a certain way, and particularly if in a rather hierarchical male society, which was what Harvard was like in the 1960s, you were expected to people in people's labs and do what they were doing. And that wasn't what I was, and it's not what I am. As it says in the book, I was actually writing 3 books at the time, and I didn't like the idea of being socialized just to turn out one experiment after another, which is what the psychology department went. So this is a memory that's true because I've rehearsed it a lot. I sat down and wrote down all the reasons to leave graduate school and all the reasons to stay. This is actually, do any of you know that Darwin did this when he was trying to decide whether to get married? He made a list of, he had like 12 kids. I decided to stay, and I'm glad I did, but I was protected by Roger Brown, who was a great professor. He was my professor, Steve Pinker's professor, my wife Ellen Winter's professor, and he said, let these people alone, they know what they're doing. But people who I won't name said we weren't going through the straight and narrow, and there wasn't a place for us. And that, I think, is probably even truer now in many fields. It's very, 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 very strict. It's not good for people who have more of a wandering kind of mind. And one of the reasons I became interested in synthesizing, and that's discussed in both of these books, as well in my memoir called A Synthesizing Mind, is I think that's actually what I am. When I decided to write an autobiography some years ago, I assumed I'd be writing about multiple intelligences, because if you have heard of me, that's what you've heard of. But I realized that didn't really explain my mind. I have a fairly typical academic mind. I'm fairly linguistic, I'm fairly logical. Music is kind of a bonus, otherwise I'm a schlemiel. But what I am is a person who takes lots of information in very easily, organizes it and reorganizes it all the time. And psychology has nothing to say about synthesizing. Do you want to know why? Because you can't bring somebody into a lab and say, in a half an hour, here's 20 books, read them, and put them together. It takes a long time. And the people who found my work on synthesizing most interesting, I won't mention them, are people who find it also describes what they do. And it's a fascinating question in the time of large language machines. Because not only can they synthesize, but they can synthesize in the way that different people would. So let's take the ed school faculty, and let's take 10 books, and you could say, tell me, ChatGPT, how would Catherine Snow organize these? How would Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot organize these? How would Richard Light? How would Andrew Ho? It's really, they may be able to do it much, much better than human beings, but currently that's what I do, and the people who work with me know, basically, I read a lot. Every day I look at a lot of newspapers and magazines. I don't read whole books much anymore, but I read books that I need to read, and I try to put it together. And if you get these books, they're my last books because I'm not writing any books. But if you want to know what I'm thinking, I am an inveterate blogger. I don't think anybody in Cambridge blogs as much as I do. And poor Annie and Shinri, who here have to socialize my blogs, but I probably have done several hundred blogs in the last few years, and they're whatever I think about, and I might go back and read Peter Dow and say, when do you think these statements were made, and see what people would think. Yeah.
So when you talk about the synthesizing process and the reading, but does it happen in the writing, or does it happen in your head, and then the writing is just distilling it?
I think the answer is yes. No, it happens in the head first. And often, if I can't sleep, it happens, or when I get up in the morning, it happens. But then it is a...
I can't sleep, I'm synthesizing. That's it. Yeah, it's a good...
That's a Descartes, right? I'm awake, therefore I synthesize, right? Or I'm nodding. But at a minimum, I will show the blog to Shinri and Annie, who work with me, and to my wife, Ellen, who's a very good writer, and sorry she can't be here, but she's not feeling well. And then sometimes I'll send it to other people who are interested in. And sometimes people will comment on the blogs. But to me, it's the writing that's the fun. And there's a story which I don't think anybody here knows. Do I know it? Yes. There was a couple at Stanford, and they were both linguists, and I could probably dig up their names. But they would often talk about their work, and they had a son, Adam, who was 4 years old, and he wanted to get their attention. And one day at breakfast, he said, "I read this very interesting paper." And that's what you need when you have people who sort of live in their heads. So yeah, a lot of my time, and many people here are really nice, have come from Project Zero. We deal with, my definition of Project Zero is we develop ideas in education, and we give them a push in the right direction. We don't run schools, we don't put out books of curriculum, but we deal with ideas, and we want educators all over the world to find them interesting and to try to apply them. And then Ellen, who I mentioned, is now trying to document the impact of Project Zero's work, which has been amazing, but Project Zero itself isn't known that well, and that's why Kristen Livingston is going to make that a reality. This is the first of 1,000 things that she's going to do to make Project Zero better known. But
actually, that's great. I was going to just turn to Project Zero, which is our host, and this is the kickoff of what we hope to be a series. So I'm not going to get into the origin story of you in the early 1970s, getting an amazing opportunity with Nelson Goodman and David Perkins, because the story is in the book, and people should get the book and read it. But I will ask you, given this amazing 60-year trajectory, and folks here will appreciate that research projects don't have 60-year lifetimes. I mean, that's just an astonishing achievement.
Research projects without any endowment, that's what Liz or Carrie said. Many places exist because they have, maybe, let's say, $20 million endowment. So every year there's a few $100,000 which they can draw.
But so what I was going to say is, so illustrate. Tell us one example, one of your favorites of a PZ project that has had that kind of impact.
I hear Dave Perkins is there, but I can't see him. Hey,
all the way
Dave.
in the back there.
Yeah. Dave and I worked in propinquity for close to 60 years, and I don't know that we ever had a fight. I'm sure we had some disagreements. But we were fortunate to get a sizable grant from the Spencer Foundation, which was very nice to us over many years, to develop something, and I forget whether they gave us the topic or whether we did, but what it meant to understand things. Now, understand seems to be totally obvious. Either you understand something or you kind of understand it or you don't. But we had time to work with many good educators locally, and some of them were not so local, to try to understand what understanding is. And a key idea, which I think came more from David than anybody else, that understanding is a performance. When you say to understand, people say, well, that's something in the head. I understand. Oh, yeah, I understood that question, Joe. But I might just repeating it. I might not know what you were talking about. But if you were to say to me, well, you've seen how Joe Blatt does an interview. Now, I want you to tell me how he would prepare if he had instead to interview Liz Dursing. Now, that's a performance of understanding, because I have to take what you did with me, and you know me somewhat, but figure out how you would do it. And so, we have a scheme where you have what you call a generative question. You have performances of understanding, you have ongoing assessment, but that's easy to say, but it took us quite a few years to work it out, and there's books which a number of people have written. Stone Weisky, you may know, probably wrote the book that I always recommend, about what it means to understand, and I think people who take Project Zero ideas about understanding seriously think very differently about what it means for themselves or for students to understand. I mean, I was just saying, let's say you read about Peter Dow's book, Schoolhouse Politics, and what happened to Bruner's work in the late 60s and early 70s. And I said to you, all right, now, can you explain to me what's happening now in the Congress? If you could draw the things that were relevant, but not the things that were irrelevant, that would be a performance of understanding. And it causes a very different kind of dialogue in your head and with other people. So that's an example of something.
That's really interesting, too, because I think that's an idea that has really permeated this school. I think that performances of understanding are increasingly seen as the culmination of a course here, so it makes sense. Well, I know from your advanced questions and from what you said, Howard, that everybody here is aware of multiple intelligences. In fact, probably a lot of people here could list the original 7 that appeared in Frames of Mind in 1983. But I bet also that a lot of people wouldn't be able to describe why that book had such impact. And I think it's because of the superstructure, substructure that justified those intelligences. So maybe you could sort of review the criteria for us a little bit, because I think that's not as widely known.
Okay, well, I just described teaching understanding and how that was a several-year project. So was multiple intelligences, in the sense that, again, the Ed School, this wasn't Project Zero, but the Ed School as a whole got a very sizable grant for a kind of a weird assignment. What is known about the nature and realization of human potential? I like to joke that's a West Coast question, not an East Coast question. It's more California than it is Connecticut. But my job on that project, which was a 5-year, well-funded project, was to know what was understood about cognition. And I used that opportunity in a wonderful research group that I had, roughly late 1970s, early 1980s, to visit different countries, consult with different experts, comb through genetics, neurology, archaeology, anthropology, to really take it was a synthesizing, really, a lot of information about human thinking. But the big mystery, which I don't know, and I don't think anybody else will ever know, was the decision to call it human intelligences. Because if I'd written human talents, nobody would have known or cared, and I wouldn't be sitting here today. But somebody, and it might have been I just don't know, decided to call them intelligence. And by pluralizing the word intelligence, I picked a fight with the IQ establishment, which has a big vested interest in thinking intelligence is a single thing which can be tested adequately with a half-an-hour paper and pencil or interview. And so this really stepped on the toes of many, many people. And there are almost no psychometricians, people who do measuring of the mind, who buy multiple intelligences. But when they say that to me, I say, have you ever read Frames of Mind? And then that just stops the silence. That brings silence, because I have 400 pages of evidence for these different intelligences. And I have just recently come up with this, but if you were going to Harvard in the 19th century, you would have to do Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. If you were going to Harvard in the 20th century, you'd have to do well on your college board, so basically linguistic and math. In the 21st century, who knows what it's going to be in the era of ChatGPT. So what we valorize as intellect changes enormously over long periods of time. But the answer to your question is that an intelligence is a capacity to ask certain questions, to advance in making progress with them. It has to be seen as useful in at least one culture, and it needs to be transmutable or referable to others. So I have a set of 8 criteria of what counts as intelligence, and I'm glad I said that because in October, with Shinri and Annie, both of here today, we wrote a 10,000-word essay called Who Owns Intelligence? And I had written an article for the Atlantic, it was called the Atlantic Monthly then, the Atlantic magazine, on who owns intelligence in 1999, so 25 years ago. And there I tried to say intelligence doesn't belong to the IQ establishment anymore, and I introduced my ideas in the interview of Robert Sternberg, who is another person who has a pluralistic view of intelligence. But 1999 is not 2024. So that article has a brief review of MI theory and the 8 intelligences that I laid out there, with linguistic and logical ones being the only ones that the IQ tests test. Some of them test spatial. They don't test musical or bodily kinesthetic or interpersonal or intrapersonal or naturalistic. But what are the intelligences of animals? Every week, Science magazine and the New York Times finds a cognitive thing which we didn't know that anything but human beings could do. And then trees, plants, communicate information even though they don't have a nervous system. That's a form of intelligence. And of course, AI is doing about everything we can do better than we can. It doesn't really deal with consciousness in a way that's adequate. But the question of intelligence now, the IQ test is so much beside the point. It isn't even relevant for human beings anymore, and it's a joke when you look at the rest of the planet. But don't tell that to your favorite psychometrician, because he or she will tell you that Gardner is full of it.
And just to underline the point there that I was encouraging to spotlight is that it's the evidence in the theory for the theory that I think really made it so compelling and made it such that I'm guessing now the week doesn't go by that you don't get a letter or an email or a telephone call with somebody saying, "What about this? Why not?"
I mean, the example that pops to mind is in the Caroline Islands. I don't even know whether I could find them on a map, somewhere in the Pacific. What's been valued is people who can navigate without a compass, looking at hundreds of stars in the sky and the way they're configured and the way the boat has been moving, what the water is like, where it was yesterday. That has nothing to do with what's an IQ test, but that's what would count as intelligence. Often in certain societies, I won't mention which ones, how well behaved the child is and how obedient it is, that's what counts as intelligent. In some societies, people were on the spectrum, it would be a sign of an intellect. In other societies, they'd put them to death because they can't pick up cues from other people. And if all you've done is just sit around universities and test people to see whether they can handle books the way you and I could in going to college, they have a really narrow view of what intellect is. And the plant and animal and computer stuff just explodes it. But you're never going to change their minds. What's the saying? Disciplines change one gravestone at a time. People learn certain stuff in graduate school and they can't get beyond it. I try not to.
That's a really interesting way to put the Thomas Kuhn paradigm change in very concrete terms. So would synthesizing have made it as an intelligence if you were doing that work today?
It might have. I stopped, in 1994, I stopped adding intelligences. Why? Because it takes a year of research, especially about the nervous system, because one of the claims about the original intelligence is that they have cortical representation, which are not identical to one another. And so brain damage depends where the brain damage is, how big, how deep, left and right. That determines which intelligences are compromised. This is a shorthand. It doesn't pass the test totally. Synthesizing probably wouldn't pass the test very well. But what I do now is I simply say that if you want to nominate something as an intelligence, you do need to take a look at the factors that I looked at. Last week, as you know, I had a public conversation in New York with Dan Goleman, who is even better known than I am for intelligence because he coined emotional intelligence, which everybody's heard of, EQ. And he's very interested now in spirituality, and I'm interested in what I call existential, namely the asking of big questions. Spiritual has a religious aspect to it, which makes me nervous. But, if we were 20 or 30 years younger, we would probably look at it in a much more systematic way. But I think, my honest answer is I opened the door, and to me that's what's important. And what I do get all the time is people say, is there a financial intelligence? Is there a humor intelligence? And I say, well, you need to have some evidence. You can't just pronounce and enunciate it.
So I'm going to turn to your questions in just a couple of minutes. I just want to, two more that I can't resist asking. One is that the multiple intelligence work was published first in the mid-'80s, and I know you continued, and as you mentioned, you still are blogging about it. But I want to make sure everybody knows that you're still active in uncovering new ideas and doing research. So I think one of the broad categories of work that you've been doing over the last decade or more, the so-called good projects, good work and so on. And I know you're just starting a new one. So can you tell us a little bit about the new one?
Sure. This will take 3 minutes, not 30 minutes, but actually literally 30 years ago, with two colleagues, also psychologists, Bill Damon and Mike Csikszentmihalyi, we spent a year together at a research center in California, and the question we were asking at the time was, can you be creative and humane at the same time? So can you use your mind freely the way we would like to be able to do it at universities, and I guess in life, it's not just in educational institutions, but also make sure that the ideas don't get abused. The Einstein is the classic example. Einstein was a physicist. He wasn't thinking about nuclear weapons, but the atom got split, and he carried that as a burden for the last years of his life. So we coined a phrase called humane creativity, which nobody understood, but we eventually decided to call what we're doing good work. And some people, including Carrie, worked on this project for many years. And we became interested in the intertwining of excellence, engagement, and ethics. Excellence means, do you know what you're doing? The answer is, we hope you do. And whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a journalist, a teacher, you need to know your stuff. Two, and very important, particularly nowadays, do you find it interesting? Do you find it engaging? Do you look forward to going to work, or do you dread it? And work is now an enormous challenge and puzzle in many parts of the world. But then what I became particularly interested in was, do you carry out this work in a way that's responsible and ethical? Because you can be very knowledgeable, you can enjoy what you're doing, but I won't finish the sentence. But I think you can all see where that's going. And so I'm interested in ethics and respect. And respect is the way I talk about how we should deal with one another as human beings. The Golden Rule, the Ten Commandments. Ethics is, what do we do in difficult positions when we don't know the right answer? Just imagine you're the Harvard Corporation now. What do you do? There's no right answer. There are lives at stake, there's money at stake, et cetera. There are values at stake. So we're very interested in that. And we started with adult professionals, and then we worked with younger people. And one of the things that was very upsetting to Wendy Fishman and me was a lot of young people, even younger than you, had said, ethics is for later. We can't afford to do it now. And you've got kids, and you know that it's very easy to push ethics off. So we became interested in the development of good work and good play at much younger ages, and Shelby Clark and Lynn Goldsmith and Danny Vasinskis and Kirsten Adam have been developing curriculum for good work and good play in middle school and high school, and now I know that Mara's here, I don't know, Shinri is here. We're working on Good Starts, and Good Starts is when do young people, and people like really young, 3, 4, 5, begin to think about themselves with reference to other people? Do they ignore other people? Do they respect other people? Do they hate other people? It's basically what I would call the Robert Putnam question. Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, most of you have heard that phrase. America's become a very egocentric, very egotistic country, where it's all about I. That's not entirely wrong, but it's gone way too far. And we're interested how early that starts, and so we're interested in this cross-culturally. And so, we've been working with colleagues, China, Taiwan, Japan, Africa, students here. We bring together students from different countries and have them talk about their childhoods and what they remember and how kids are and we're now in a situation where we need to have support to do this. But we think that it's never too early to begin to think of yourself in relationship to others. And probably at this point, I should mention Mara Krzyzewski, who's worked with me forever, and I've worked with her forever, but she is our expert on the schools in Reggio Emilia, which are, for many people, including me, the most exciting schools for young kids in the world. And there, they work very hard not to make it just about I, but to develop a corporate sense from a very early age. And it's hard. It's very hard in the 21st century because almost all of our media are very I-centered. They don't bring people together. They either clash them or make you push your own, how many influencers you can be.
So let's turn to audience questions. You mentioned one already, which I also thought was particularly interesting, about what phase of your life would you most want to relive, and you mentioned the good old college years. Another one that really struck me was, in what ways do you see the body of research and theories that you've created having an impact on professions other than teaching and learning? What's the sort of broader impact of your work in other fields, other disciplines, other practices?
Yeah, I would say it's less than I would like. Initially, our work was very influential in journalism, and there was a lot of work in journalism using materials we developed, but journalism now is in such crisis that it doesn't really have much bandwidth to work with the kinds of materials that we developed. I do think that a lot of the work in artificial intelligence does have to do with ethics, and some of the people who work with us are actually working those issues now. Whether they know about our work in particular, I don't know, but I think, the big question is to what extent do we consign difficult ethical issues to computational entities as opposed to having human beings deal with them. And I gave a talk at MIT last week, and I said that I think a lot of the stuff which we used to require of students in my day, and maybe in your day, and maybe in your day, it's all in here. And so it becomes more of an option than something you have to learn. But respect and ethics can't be in here. Respect is how we deal with the people whom we see every day, and ethics is when a difficult question comes up. Let's say you're in the Harvard Corporation. What do? You can't look it up.
So this is an experience that I've had frequently. Some of you know that I work especially in media and technology, and invariably people whose main work is technology have trouble with the technology. So I am not seeing a flood of questions on the Slido, so I'm going to ask our colleagues to see if they do. I'm only seeing a single question, but I'll ask it to you while my colleagues.
Well, actually, I have the questions. If you want to see them.
No, I'm talking about the live questions that
I'm
people
sorry,
have submitted. We haven't tried this Slido technique before, and I'm not getting much of a feed here. So anyway, one of the questions is the problem that we clearly are facing in K-12 education across the United States, different from what other countries are experiencing because we haven't figured out how to make good use of multiple intelligence's insights. I think that's the thrust of the question.
Well, but to me, this is two separate questions. We have good educators in this country, but education is not taken terribly seriously in this country. So I look at Finland and Singapore. They're two countries which couldn't be more different from one another, but students there get a better education because it's treated as a real profession and as a way to advance. And I often say, if we tripled the salaries of teachers in the United States, the situation would be totally different. But that's not the case. I don't think that multiple intelligences is the missing ingredient in American education. But when I talk about this, I say there are two ideas that are very consonant with multiple intelligences, and both of the books discuss it, and that's individuation and pluralization. Individuation means know as much about every person as you can and teach the person in a way that they find it easier to learn. I mentioned I was a bad teacher at K-12. I was a piano teacher. I wasn't so bad at that, and I try to adjust how I taught the piano given whoever the student was. And individuation can now be done with anybody who has any kind of technology. There's no reason why, if you have 6 kids, that they can't learn Pythagorean theorem or the French Revolution in ways that make sense to them.
Well, not my kids. I'm obviously having trouble with this. I take your point generally.
Yeah. That's individuation. So have people learn in ways that are comfortable to them. But pluralization is anything that's important. And I talked earlier about understanding evolution or revolution. Should be taught in more than one way. And if a teacher says, that's how I learned it, and that's the only way to teach it, that teacher is guilty of malpractice. There may be certain things very advanced in certain fields which we don't have a number of ways of teaching, but anything which we want our students in general to know, any of the sort of the major disciplines and topics can be presented in many different ways. And what I'm saying now, to be very literal about it, is multiple intelligence is useful in helping individual kids learn something they need to learn in ways that are comfortable for them, and it's useful for teachers because teachers should decide what's important and then present it in a number of different ways.
Is it inherently an interactive practice? In other words, you working with a learner and finding out what works with them, or could you write it into a curriculum, for example?
I'm sure you could write it into a curriculum. This is what David Rose works on. What's the name of his?
Universal Design for Learning.
Universal Design for Learning is trying to find lots of different ways to present kids, particularly ones who have learning problems of one another. So I think the answer is sure, you could create textbooks like that, but once you have the idea, you can co-construct. I used to have a line, see if I can remember it. When I have one kid, I thought all kids were the same. When I had 2 kids, I said there are 2 kinds of kids. When I had 3 kids, I said all kids are different. When I had 4 kids, I was so busy making a living that I had no time for theories. But the more we, even I was just watching something today, even identical twins. I guess this was I remember some podcast I was watching. Even identical twins, after a certain age, don't necessarily learn in the same way. And of course, they have the same genes, but not only are their environments somewhat different, but they often are motivated to be different from one another.
So, interestingly, someone has asked a question which feels kind of personal, but I'm going to relay it. I'm interested in your answer, and I'm just making clear that I'm not responsible for the question in case you don't like it, which is, the question is literally, what is your routine or technique for staying so mentally sharp and healthy?
The obvious answer is pick the right parents.
Is it a morning practice that you do every day? Is it a spiritual thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I wasn't kidding. I mean, genetics is very important. I mean, as my friends know, I mean, I'm dealing with deaths every day. And so, many people when they reach my age. On the other hand, we're having lunch, my wife and I, alone, on Saturday with Jerry Holton, 103 years old on May 21st. He's a professor here. So, and he's still totally lucid. Genetics is obviously the thing. But loving your work, having a family who is supportive, having colleagues whom you love, and vice versa, all that helps. I mean, one wonderful thing about being an academic is that when you retire from your paid job, you can keep doing it. Whereas in other jobs, it's very difficult to do. So when I go to reunions of my class, I often don't tell them. I often don't find them very interesting because it's mostly about people's golf game, and they're often in professions where they can't continue, they have to retire. I'm very worried that in the 21st century, academe, which is what I've been lucky enough to be able to do, may end up being just something that only people with means can do. I worry a great deal about that. There are some things which you can do as a hobby, but there are other things where you need to have, I mean, if I were doing benchtop work in neurology, I would need to have big grants. Maybe if I wanted to go to Singapore or China and master the language, I could do that. But, our entire funding stuff is very much up in the air now. And we in the universities have not found a way to make the case. If I were more of an optimist, I would point out that except for the Catholic Church, no institutions have lasted as long as universities. The Catholic Church has lasted for 2,000 years. If you watched Turner Classic Music movie last night, you could see the greatest story of all, because it was a George Stevens movie about Christ. But universities have existed for 1,000 years. So don't bet against them. But I think we're going through a very hard time. And, we take some blame. I mean, there is some blame for that that we need to take. But getting rid of them certainly is not the solution.
So that sounded like you're actually optimistic about how this is all going to turn out.
Well, I think anybody who knows history knows that unless we destroy the planet, the pendulum is going to swing back and forth. How it's going to swing, nobody knows. I have 5 grandchildren, and I'm rooting for them. But I think it's for people in the starting out in the workplace now, it's a very difficult time.
So just so folks know, we're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes and then have an opportunity, I believe, to buy the collected works and also to get them signed by the author. So I do want to ask you one more sort of, if you will, synthesizing a couple of audience questions here and say, you've spoken several times about artificial intelligence, but I think what we really want to know is, are you optimistic that it encourages and fosters people's thinking, or are you more on the side of, gee, people are going to think less because they're more become dependent on AI?
That's a very good question. I have to preface it by saying that by nature I'm a pessimist, though I try to live like an optimist. But I'm given what my family went through. I mentioned they're Holocaust survivors. It's hard to be optimistic. I guess what I think is, and I may be just repeating myself here, that a lot of what we required people to learn until now is going to become optional. And that's okay as long as they still want to learn. So, if you're really interested in geography or geometry or in what it takes to write a fugue or in understanding string theory, that's you have an incredible opportunity to do so. But if you're not motivated to exercise the parts of your mind that would do that, then you will have I would think, a much less interesting kind of life. At Project Zero now, we have a Center for Digital Thriving, and that title is an optimistic title, but you don't have to be a pessimist to think that a lot of people are more isolated and have less of a respect for truth now than certainly they did 50 years ago. And we need to have strong counters to that. So I'm really looking for people and places and experiences which can push things in the right direction. And when you say, are you optimistic or pessimistic, I'm going to use the Jewish community on the one hand, the Chinese community on the other, and then I'll use a Romanian example because it's on my mind. When both for Jews and for people in China, when there were repressive regimes, people just worked in the basement and didn't show anybody else what they were doing. And I had friends in Romania. In fact, one of them was a student here, and they lived through the Ceausescu period. He was a terrible dictator who was ruthless. And I said, how did you live through that period? And my friend said, music and mathematics. And I said, why? And he said, because nobody could keep me from that. So if you ask me, am I optimistic that the life of the mind will continue? I think as long as human beings exist, whether or not we use AI is irrelevant. People will have the opportunity to use their mind. But if you say, is it going to be easier or harder in the 21st century, it's very hard to be optimistic about that. But people wouldn't come to an education school unless you believed that you could do it. And I have 5 grandkids, and damn it, they're going to do it.
Well, that's terrific lead in. I'm going to give myself the privilege of the last 2 questions, and you just led into one of them, which is somewhere in this audience may very well be the next Howard Gardner. And so what...
Poor person.
What problem or challenge in education or human development should that person start thinking about and working on in order to have the kind of breakthroughs and insights and impact that you've had?
Okay, well, that's a question which would require thought. But
are you suggesting the rest of my questions didn't?
No, but I would give a glib answer, which is sort of what I've begun to think and write about. My wife and I we're both very interested in the arts, so we've come up with a clever title, AI in the Age of AI, Artistic Intelligences in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, What Happens to Artists. So that's something that we're interested in. So that's one thing. The other thing is that in this talk I gave at MIT last week, which I think I probably will write up, I said we have to throw out the notion, and this will not win me a lot of points at the ed school, but I'll say it, of preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school, maybe college, and maybe university. I think it's going to be cradle to grave, and people who take the mind and the body seriously will be able to start as early as they want and go as far as they want. But when you don't have that kind of support, it won't happen. And I did watch the Zantz webinar today on homelessness. There are countless homeless infants and children in America now who don't have a home. Either they live in hotels, or they live in tents, or they live on the streets, or they are able to stay on a couch, but other people can't stay there. And I said, well, is this true in other countries? And nobody had a particularly good answer. But I remembered I was in Adelaide, Australia. Anybody here from Australia? Okay, I can say it. No, about 20 years ago, and for some reason I was interested in homelessness, and I said, how many homeless people are there in Adelaide? And they said, there's 60 of them, and we can tell you who they are.
Wow.
That's a society that cares about that.
That's
sort
amazing.
of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, last question before we let folks go buy your books, and that is, what question should I have asked you if I were smart enough to? What do you want to?
Yeah, all right. You are well known as being not only a Sesame Street person, but having your own Muppet, which almost no other human being has. But I think Sesame Street it's searching now for what should be its equivalent for 2025, because I was around when it was started. Mm-hmm. Lloyd Morissette and who was it? Joan Gans Cooney.
Right.
I'm glad the names still came back to me. So if Lloyd Morissette, who was then at Carnegie, later at Markle, came to you and said, all right, how can we do the Sesame Street for 2025 to 2050? What would you tell him?
Oh, no, I didn't mean a question for me. That's not the role reversal. I meant anything I didn't think to ask you that you would have liked to have shared. But thank you for asking that question. I will just mention that that's something I'm thinking about and trying to work on a lot. But I meant, what should I have asked you?
No, I think the question of, the last questions, what do I think people should be working on? But maybe another thing to say is that psychology was very exciting in 1960 when Jerome Bruner started the Center for Cognitive Studies, and many people hung around there. I think I would say take a look at what the people who have the liveliest minds now, what is it that they're interested in, what questions are they asking, and you may not be something that you're interested in, or it may not be something that you're good at. But if you have a wide open mind, that's good. And that's why I look at a lot of magazines and newspapers. I don't look at social media, and I don't look at podcasts unless somebody says you have to look at it. But if you read widely, you get a sense of what people are interested in. When Ezra Klein says he's worried about how hard it is to build things, I pay attention to that. Yeah. If you don't know Ezra Klein, he's the very good reporter and interviewer for the New York Times. So also, see where people who have lively minds, what they're asking and thinking.
And I think it's fair to add that with the wonderful sampling of your work so far in these two books, you're still doing it, and one good place to read about current ideas and what people are thinking about, and just getting really stimulated about things to work on are your blogs. So I just want to remind people that Howard continues to write and to share really good insights and really stimulating stuff. So please join me in thanking Howard for sharing so much with us.
Thank you.
And